King David is bringing the offerings of the children of Israel to the building of the temple. And it is a glorious day. David has worked very hard. In fact, David has been very thorough concerning the preparations for this day. So look at 1 Chronicles 29, verses 5 to 9, where David asks, "Now who is willing to consecrate themselves to the Lord today?" Then the leaders of families, officers of the tribes of Israel, commanders of thousands, commanders of hundreds, the officials in charge of the king's work, they all gave willingly. They gave toward the work on the temple of God 5,000 talents, 10,000 darics of gold, 10,000 talents of silver, 18,000 talents of bronze, 100,000 talents of iron. Anyone who had precious stones, they gave them to the treasury of the temple of the Lord in the custody of Jehiel the Gershonite. The people rejoiced at the willing response of their leaders, for they had given freely, wholeheartedly to the Lord. David the king also rejoiced greatly. So the first principle that David understood that day, as the offerings poured into the storehouse, as the people gathered together their gold and silver and all their precious metal, in your notes, David understood God gives. See, God is the giver of all gifts. It is God who gives, and none of the gifts that were pouring into the temple that day were from man. Rather, it all belonged to God. It came from God, because God gives. See, we sing in that hymn, "We give you but your own, and any gifts we bring, all that we have is yours alone, a trust from you, our King." So David tells us that the first principle is God gives. In the biblical sense, you have everything you need to fulfill God's plan for your life at this moment. Everything. You do. God gave it to you. God has given. Or you may have the natural reaction when you hear that statement, and you're thinking that of all the things that maybe you don't have, or you're thinking of the things that you feel ill-equipped for. But in the biblical sense, you have everything. You have everything you need to fulfill God's plan for your life at this moment. And we're not talking about next month or a year from now, but for what you need to fulfill God's plan for your life. You have already been given it by God. Now, people will often say, "Pastor, if I could just win the $1 million lottery, I would do some great things for the church and for God." And we're always looking out there in the future, saying, "If I had this or if I had that." But the message this morning is God gives, as David discovered with the offering of the temple of the children of Israel. God gives exactly what you need for that moment. And he's not going to ask you to do anything for which he has not provided the resources for. This is not a what-if game. Today, it's a what you're going to do with what you got game. Principle number one, God gives. What part of that principle do we really have trouble understanding? Let's look at three parts about God and about his giving. Part one, in your notes, God gives is power. If we are going to understand something about a giving God, the first thing we need to know is that God is a God of power. In other words, there are things that God must do simply because we cannot do them ourselves. Look at 1 Chronicles 29, where David says, "Wealth and honor come from you. You are the ruler of all things. In your hands are strength and power to exalt and to give strength to all." Looking at 1 Chronicles 14, where David and his men went up to Baal Perim, and there he defeated them. He said, "As waters break out, as God broke out against my enemies by my hand." So that place was called Baal Perazim. Here we hear of the awesome power of God on behalf of his own people. Really, is it not our tendency to take our resources and we try to work things out just to the best of our ability? And we become fleshly and totally dependent on ourselves and our own strivings. Sort of like the church in Galatia, where the Apostle Paul was writing. Look at Galatians 3, verse 1. You foolish Galatians, Paul says, who has bewitched you? Before your very eyes, Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. And Paul goes on to say, you Galatians started with the Spirit, and now you're what? You're striving according to the flesh. Or in the words of the hymn, stand up for Jesus, there's that phrase that stands out in stanza 3. Stand up for Jesus, stand in his strength alone. The arm of flesh will fail you. You dare not trust your own. So put on the gospel armor, each piece put on with prayer, where duty calls or danger be never wanting there. See, God gives. God alone has the power to give. Hymns, they are great in theology. And once we understand that part, we can stop hanging on to our possessions for our security and our worship. Part 1, God gives his power. In your notes, part 2, God gives his provision. God gives, number 1, his power. God also gives, number 2, his provisions. Look at 1 Chronicles 29 again. Yours, Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the majesty and the splendor. Everything in heaven and earth is yours. Yours, Lord, is the kingdom. You are exalted as head over all. But who am I, David says? Who are my people? That we should be able to give as generously as this. Everything comes from you. And we have given you only what comes from your hand. See, David is convinced that his people were able to give and to do these acts of worship only because God has provided for them in the first place. See, first, God gives his power. Secondly, God gives his provision. And on the back of your notes, God will never ask you to do anything. God will never ask you to be anything. And God will never ask you to give anything that God will not first provide for you. But what a lesson that is. When God asks us to commit ourselves. Oh, we get nervous. There's this common scenario when your pastor or church leader comes to you, asks you to teach a Bible class or join a board or to help with a project. It's a very common thing that we get a bit upset. They say they don't think they can do it. They become tense and nervous. We've all been there. But then we must remember that God never asked us to do anything, and God will never ask us to be anything, and God will never ask us to give anything that God will not provide for us. See, God's calling is God's enabling. God's leading is God's providing. God's directing means that God is going to provide the resources. Sometimes we look at our stewardship as if it were totally based on our man-made resources. And we start biting our spiritual fingernails. Paul was worried about that also. But God said to Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in your weakness. God was saying to Paul that you don't need to worry about your resources. I've provided for you. When one is preaching, there's a principle that you don't use superlatives continuously because nothing is great anymore if everything is great. But just look at how the Bible talks about God. Look at Isaiah 55, verse 7. Let the wicked forsake their ways and the unrighteous their thoughts. Let them turn to the Lord. He will have mercy on them, and to our God. For he will what? Freely pardon. When you start talking about God, you have to use superlatives. God's pardon is abundant, is freely given. Looking at Ephesians 3, Paul says, to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Look also at 2 Corinthians 9. Paul says, thanks be to God for his what? Indescribable gift. Looking at John 10, verse 10, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy, but Jesus says, I have come that you may have life, and there's a comma, and then have it to what? To the full. Do you see that comma there? Jesus talks about having life, comma, then he adds, and life to the full. That is the abundant life. So I ask you, which side of the comma do you live on today? Do you have just life, or do you have life to the full? Are you just living, or do you have abundant life? Because God is the giver. God provides. In God there is a love that cannot be fathomed. In God there is a life that can never die. In God there is a righteousness that can never be tarnished. In God there is a peace that can never be understood, a hope that can never be disappointed, a light that can never be darkened, a happiness that can never be interrupted, a strength that can never be enfeebled, a purity that can never be defiled, a wisdom that can never be baffled. But most important, in God, there is a resource that can never be exhausted. So number one, God gives the power. Number two, God gives the provision. Part 3 in your notes, God gives his partnership. God gives his power, his provision, and he gives his partnership. That means I can be spiritually linked with God as a partner, a partnership with God. In other words, God gives us first so that we will be able to give from his resources. Boy, what a one-side partnership that is. And it's all in our favor. I don't think I deserve this, but God provides all the resources. All the goods come from his storehouse. All the wisdom from his storehouse. I'm just a partner. Look at what David says about this partnership. Look at 1 Chronicles 29 again. But who am I, David said, who are my people, that we should be able to give as generously as this? Everything comes from you, and we have given you only what comes from your hand. Lord our God, all this abundance that we have provided for building you a temple in your holy name, it comes from your hand. All of it belongs to you. How can we experience this partnership? Well, it starts, first of all, with God's giving. Nothing happens until God gives first. So in your notes, God gives through me to others. The partnership is that God gives to me so that I can pass on and give to others. We are blessed to be a blessing. And then in your notes, God gives through others to me. Nothing happens until God gives, though. When God gives to others, it is also to pass on whatever has been given to them. God's principle of giving his power, his provision, giving his partnership, is so that we can become ourselves a river. We are not to be a reservoir or a swamp of stagnant waters. Jesus tells us that we keep ourselves, what we keep for ourselves, what we do not pass on to others, we're going to lose. The moment that I dam up the river and keep God's blessings given to me only, keeping them for myself, at that very moment I begin to lose them, because we are blessed to become a blessing to others. So in conclusion, in your notes, part 1, from God's power, I see God's ability to give. Since God is the giver, God has the power to give to us. Part 2, from God's provision, I also see God's willingness to give. It's one thing to have the ability, quite another to have the willingness to give. And when God gives to us, we then have the ability as people of God to also give away. As God's people today, we can show our willingness to give, as God so willingly loved us, and he gave his only son Jesus to suffer and die on the cross for us. In Jesus, we can see God's willingness to give. And then part 3, in your notes, from God's partnership, I see God's reason to give. because we are blessed to become a blessing. And that's the most important truth for us today. God loved us, gave himself for us, so that we as partners with him can also pass it on. We give because he first gave to us. So repeat after me. What you going to do? With what you got.
With what you got.
Amen.